Wonderful. So our next speaker is Dr. Richard Fox from Butterfly Conservation. He's led their work in recording changes to the UK butterfly and moth population for over 25 years, and he's published over 80 papers. So he is the person with the knowledge, but also with the enthusiasm and passion for butterflies and moths. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Richard, to listen to what you're going to tell us.
Thanks very much, Mary. Hello, everyone. So we're going to continue the theme, really, the theme of evidence-based, scientifically based evidence for wildlife-friendly gardening, and in a way carrying on the theme about how you can have more invertebrates in your garden for hedgehogs and other more obvious kinds of garden wildlife to feed on. So there's a lot said and written about gardening for butterflies by Butterfly Conservation, the organization, the charity that I work for, but also by many other organizations and individuals. So you go out on the internet, you'll find tons of information out there. And whilst it's all grounded in common sense and ecological knowledge, very little of this recommended advice is actually based on scientifically tested evidence. And so we set out, this is research we published last year, so it's relatively new. We set out to sort of fill this evidence gap using some citizen science data from Butterfly Conservation's Garden Butterfly Survey. And this was work that was carried out by myself and Dr. Elizabeth Hordley, who's a postdoctoral researcher with me at Butterfly Conservation. So just to start, a little bit of context about the state of butterflies. You're probably already aware of this, but we have very good evidence in the UK that butterflies have declined. That comes from a fantastic citizen science scheme called the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. So this is most of the data into that scheme comes from people walking butterfly transects. So this is volunteers walking a fixed route in good weather on a weekly basis and identifying and counting all of the butterflies that they see in a sort of imaginary 5-meter box as they walk along their transect. And as you can see from the map there, this is done at thousands of sites each year across the UK and gives us really good evidence, really good data on how butterfly populations are changing over time. And so the graph over here is all of that data distilled down into a couple of lines, basically. So this is the government's official multi-species butterfly indicator. So it's produced by us, but it's published by the government and accredited by the UK Statistics Authority. And the dotted line shows how the abundance of all of the butterflies species that we have in Britain goes up and down from year to year. A lot of that variation is down to things like the weather. But over a long time period, and this monitoring goes back to the 1970s, we can statistically see through that noise, that variation from year to year, to see a significant downward trend. So butterflies are less abundant now than they were back in the 1970s in the UK. And we see that happening in different types of landscapes. So this plot here shows a decline in butterfly abundance on farmland sites monitored by the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. And this one, an even more significant, even steeper decline of butterflies at woodland sites. And the only caveat really about this fantastic monitoring is that most of the sites where these butterfly transects take place are nature reserves or other areas of land that are good for wildlife and that are managed at least in part for biodiversity. So it's possible that what's happening to butterflies on these sites is not reflective of how butterflies are faring in the broader landscape, although to be honest, they're likely be doing better on these sites than elsewhere. But we do have other information to draw upon as well. for example, our big butterfly count that happens every summer with tens and tens of thousands of people taking part across the UK. And so these are more recent trends just over the last 14 years from the big butterfly count. But the species listed in purple in this part of the graph down here are all species that have become less abundant over that most recent 14-year period. And the thing about the big butterfly counts is that the vast majority of them are done in gardens, in urban areas, in parks, in school grounds, and in the normal farmed countryside. So this is supporting that idea that butterflies are genuinely in decline across the whole of the UK in all sorts of different landscapes and land use types. So because butterflies and, as we've heard, hedgehogs and much of the rest of our wildlife is in decline, there's a great interest in people wanting to, try and do something themselves to reverse those declines, and that's all tied in with the growing popularity of wildlife-friendly gardening, both here in the UK and elsewhere around the world. Now, I said at the very start that a lot of the information is particularly on butterflies, but it's true for other garden wildlife as well, is not based on rigorous scientific evidence. But there is some scientific evidence. So we know, for example, that the presence of particular features in gardens, things like trees and hedges and ponds, can be good for wildlife. So here's a study that was also published last year, where the researchers showed, this is in Britain, showed that you get more butterflies, a greater abundance of butterflies, and a greater diversity of butterflies, more different types of butterfly in gardens that have a higher garden quality index. And that index the researchers made up based on whether gardens had things like trees, hedges, flowering plants, and ponds. So there's definitely evidence of a relationship there, but in that study we can't unpick that. We can't tell whether which of these different features is providing the benefit for butterflies. There's been quite a lot there's been some research, and there's an awful lot said and written about growing particular plants to provide nectar and pollen for pollinators, including butterflies. And there are some studies of this, some of them incredibly detailed. So this plot was looking at different varieties of lavender and the numbers and types of different insect pollinators visiting each different variety. There's a really nice study showing that even having a little, a tiny sort of mini meadow, a little wildflower plot in gardens encourages more pollinating insects to visit. And then there are some correlative studies as well. So this is just where you measure the butterflies or other insects that are seen in a garden and relate that to the amount of flowers. So these two studies, one of them in France and the other in the US, both showing that you see more butterflies in gardens that have more flowers. It's perhaps not rocket science, but it's important to show that these things are actually true and not just what we assume to be true. It's also been shown, and again, it's not particularly surprising, that the size of a garden and the makeup of the surrounding landscape also play a role in determining the kinds of wildlife and the amount of wildlife that you're going to see in your garden. So, if your garden's in a very urban area or a very rural area, then that will affect the biodiversity, the wildlife that you see in your garden. And I mentioned again that not many of these recommendations for sort of wildlife gardening techniques have been tried and tested experimentally. Although this paper from 20 years ago now did do that for a range of different recommended wildlife gardening techniques to a greater or lesser success. So one of the techniques they assessed was whether growing nettles, stinging nettles in your garden would attract butterflies like small tortoiseshell and peacock to breed on those nettles. And they found that that was really unsuccessful, was not a successful wildlife gardening technique. Okay, so our aim was to assess whether two simple and often recommended wildlife-friendly gardening practices, namely having long grass in your garden and having flowering ivy in your garden, would affect the butterflies that you see in your garden. And to do that, we used data from the citizen science program, the Garden Butterfly Survey. So this is a really simple thing anyone can take part in if you have a garden or access to some kind of shared garden space. And there's no complicated methodology. It's really just you note down how many butterflies and which types of butterflies you see throughout the year in your garden. And each year we get about 1,000 gardens participating. There's quite a good spread across the UK. And for this study, we used 6 years of data from the Garden Butterfly Survey. In total, there are about 4,500 gardens took part over that 6-year period, but we filtered them down to a set of over 800 gardens that had good levels of recording throughout the year. And from these, we estimated two, what I've called their butterfly metrics, so two measures of garden butterflies. One was an estimate of the total abundance of butterflies seen in the garden each year, and the other was a measure of species richness, so the different types, how many different types of butterfly were seen in that garden in each year. Now, we use relative species richness because there are many more types of butterflies down in the southeast of England compared to the northwest of Scotland. So a fantastic garden for butterflies and other wildlife in Scotland is never going to attract as many types of butterflies as even a moderate garden down in the southeast. So we used a measure that was relative. How many butterflies do you see in your garden compared to what's available in your wider landscape? And we also excluded species that are rarely seen in gardens. So our analyses, and importantly our results, are really focused in on the butterflies that commonly visit gardens. Now, before we got too far ahead of ourselves, we really needed to check that the data that are gathered through the Garden Butterfly Survey, particularly for the abundance of butterflies, do actually represent what's happening to butterflies. I mentioned that the methodology is very simple. There's no standardization. So we wanted to be sure about the data before we embarked on measuring these wildlife-friendly gardening techniques. And so we took our measures, our abundance from the Garden Butterfly Survey for each species in each pair of years. So we measured the change in abundance from 2016 to 2017, and then the change in abundance for the same species from 2017 to 2018, and so on, for each of the species, and we compared them to the same measures from the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. So the gold standard measure of all that intense monitoring, very rigorous, standardized monitoring that's done on all of the nature reserves. And what we see on the plot here, so each of these dots is a species year sort of combination. And the important thing is this dotted line, which is where things are the same, where there's the same amount of change in the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme and in the Garden Butterfly Survey. And you can see that all of the points cluster very closely to that line, which means that, brilliant news, the Garden Butterfly Survey is picking up the genuine changes in butterfly populations that are happening out there across the UK from year to year. So now that we're happy about that, we can move forward to our assessment. So we've got our butterfly metrics from those 800 or so gardens and 6 years of of data from the Garden Butterfly Survey. We wanted to look at the landscape immediately surrounding each garden. So we're talking about sort of 250 to 500 meters around each garden, looking at the broad land use types. And we took that data from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology land cover map. And then the most important piece of the jigsaw really is information that participants in the Garden Butterfly Survey have given us about the size of their garden, but also about whether they do these wildlife gardening practices. So do they have long grass in their garden? And if so, how much do they have? And do they have flowering ivy in their garden in the autumn? Okay, so we had three sort of main questions then. The first one is to understand the effects of the landscape, the surrounding landscape, so that we can interpret our results in that broader context. The second question is about the actual wildlife gardening practices. Do they affect butterfly abundance and species richness? And then the third question is about whether those two things interact with each other. So, does it matter what your local landscape is like? Will that affect how effective the wildlife gardening measures are? So to start with then, does the landscape surrounding your garden affect the butterflies that you see? Well, yes, it does. So the more woodland that you have in your local environment, the more types of butterflies you will see on average in your garden. The more farmland there is also positive for the abundance and richness of butterflies. But the more urban your local landscape, as has been found in many other studies, that has a negative impact on butterflies and other biodiversity. We also found that the size of your garden is significant. So if you have a bigger garden, you will see more butterflies and a greater variety of butterflies than if you have a smaller garden. So we need to correct for these things when we're looking at our measures, our wildlife gardening practices. So let's move on to that. That's the kind of key thing that everyone wants to know about. So first of all, does having long grass in your garden affect the butterflies that you see? Well, yes, it does. So you get significantly more total abundance of butterflies, significantly greater abundance of butterflies if you have long grass present in your garden than if you don't. It's not an enormous difference. It's about a 9% increase on average in the total abundance of butterflies over the year. And it also, you also get significantly greater richness. So you see more types of butterflies in your garden if you have long grass present than if you don't. Again, it's not a big difference, but it's a statistically significant difference. So long grass in gardens does lead to more butterflies in your garden. But really interesting point was we then redid these two analyses using separately for the butterflies whose caterpillars eat grass and the butterflies whose caterpillars don't eat grass. And we found that this effect, this increase in abundance, is entirely driven by those butterfly species whose caterpillars eat grass. And that suggests that the benefits that you're getting in your garden for butterflies by having long grass is because butterfly species are seeing that long grass as either potential or actual breeding habitat. So they're either coming into your garden thinking, oh, this is somewhere that I could breed, or they're actually already in your garden breeding in this long grass. And that's really important, of course, because we're not going to turn around the declines, the national declines of butterflies by providing them with a few flowers to drink from. The only way we're going to turn around those long-term UK-wide declines is providing more places for butterflies and better habitats for butterflies to breed in. Okay, so having long grass is good for butterflies in the garden. Well, what about the area of long grass? Does it matter how much long grass you have? Well, yes, it does. And some of these gardens have got a lot of long grass beyond what most of us could possibly achieve in our own gardens. But you do get more butterflies, greater abundance of butterflies as the area increases, and you also get a greater diversity of butterflies as the area increases. But you can see those lines are pretty straight. So actually what that means is, no matter how big your garden is, the more long grass you have, the better. And again, these effects, these significant effects, were driven entirely by those butterflies that use grass for their caterpillars. That's what their caterpillars eat. That's where they're breeding. Okay, so that's really good news that having long grass, here's real scientific evidence that having long grass in your garden is good for butterflies, and the more you have, the better. So what about flowering ivy? Again, this is often recommended. Ivy flowers late in the year, as I'm sure you all know, at a time when most of the other wildflowers have finished flowering, and you only have to look at flowering ivy to see how important it is for a wide variety of insects feeding from the nectar and the pollen of ivy flowering in the autumn. So does having flowering ivy in your garden benefit butterflies? Well, actually, it doesn't overall. There wasn't a difference, there wasn't a significant difference in the total abundance or richness of butterflies, depending on whether or not there was flowering ivy in the garden. But there were differences for particular species. So we found that for red admiral and comma, two butterfly species that seem to be particular fans of ivy nectar, their numbers were greater in gardens that had flowering ivy. Again, it's not a huge difference, but it's a statistically significant difference. And then importantly, we found for the holly blue, which lays its eggs on ivy flower buds and its caterpillars feed on the ivy, you get significantly more of those in your garden if you've got flowering ivy, which again suggests that people, by providing flowering ivy, people are providing breeding habitat for butterflies, in this case for the holly blue, which is fantastic. Okay, so both of these easy, cheap, well, they're not even cheap, they're free, low maintenance wildlife gardening practices do significantly increase the abundance and the variety of butterflies seen in gardens. But the changes, the increases that you see are quite small. But I'd like you to put that into context. There are almost 730,000 hectares of gardens in Britain. It's the equivalent of over 1 million football pitches. So you can see how that could scale up. If lots of people were leaving long grass or having flowering ivy in their gardens, then these effects are going to massively scale up and have a much bigger impact, a much bigger benefit for butterflies at that larger scale. Okay, so coming towards the end, but the final question, if you remember back to that point, was about whether these benefits that you get from having long grass in your garden or flowering ivy in your garden vary depending on where your garden is, depending on the local landscape. And so we were keen to look at this as well, and we found out that it does make a big difference actually. So if we look at the amount of agricultural land or arable land around your garden, we see that in gardens that have a lot of, a huge amount of arable land around them at this end of the graph, having long grass, shown here in blue, makes a much bigger difference to the abundance of butterflies that you see compared to in a garden that's in a less agricultural area. So it really does make a difference where your garden is. And it's the same in urban areas as well. So I mentioned earlier on that we showed in this study, and many other studies have shown, that as the amount of urbanization increases, biodiversity declines, and we found that the numbers of butterflies and the variety of butterflies in gardens declines as areas become more urban. So the slopes on these graphs will be going down. But what we find again is in the most urban areas, then the blue, which is the result of the presence of long grass compared to the whatever that kind of orangey red color is, which are gardens with no long grass, these differences are greater than they are for the average trend. So just to sum up, we found, not surprisingly, that garden size and the surrounding landscape, things that generally you can't do much about, it's not easy to change these kind of things, have an impact on the butterflies that you see in your garden. But crucially, doing simple things like allowing some grass to grow long in your garden, having ivy in your garden and allowing it to flower in the autumn does bring genuine benefits for our butterflies. And that these benefits are greater in highly arable and in highly urban areas. And the latter is particularly important because most of our gardens are in highly urban areas. So urban in this context does not mean that you are surrounded by concrete and skyscrapers. It just means that you're surrounded by other houses and other gardens. So that counts as urban. And obviously most of our gardens and our houses where we live are surrounded by other houses and other gardens. And so the benefits of these techniques for butterflies are really important for most of us. They're highly applicable to most of us. So that's it in a nutshell. Obviously, there's lots of other wildlife friendly or sort of butterfly friendly gardening advice out there that it would be good to look at and to produce some more evidence for. We've only looked at these two things, but we've shown clearly that they do provide benefits, and we've been able to feed that through into information that's available to people. So we have Butterfly Conservation's Wild Spaces website, which provides bespoke information on how to improve your garden, no matter what kind of space you've got. So whether it's just a little patio or a little yard in a highly urban area, or whether you've got a bigger garden out in the countryside, there's lots of bespoke information about how you can improve that space for butterflies, moths, and other wildlife. So I just need to thank all of the participants in the Garden Butterfly Survey, because we wouldn't have been able to do any of this without their counting. To Peter Eales, who created the Garden Butterfly Survey website, and the Heather Corrie Fund, which funded the research. And so I'm happy to take any questions. Unfortunately, this paper is not open access because it costs a huge amount of money to make it open access. But if anyone would like a copy of the actual paper, then feel free to contact me on one of these platforms, and I'll happily send you a PDF of it.